The moment I saw my parents walk into that courtroom, I felt 16 again. 16 and terrified, standing on their doorstep with nothing but a plastic bag of clothes and a secret growing inside me that they couldn't forgive. But this wasn't 20 years ago. This was now. And the woman they were about to face wasn't the broken girl they'd thrown away. She was someone they never imagined I could become. You see, when life strips everything from you at 16, when your own blood decides you're too shameful to share their roof, you learn something most people never have to discover. You learn that rock bottom isn't the end of your story. It's the foundation you build everything else on. And sometimes, if you're lucky enough to have someone believe in you when you can't believe in yourself, that foundation becomes unshakable. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of how I went from homeless and pregnant to holding a gavel. How the parents who abandoned me for embarrassing them ended up hiring a lawyer to sue me, only to discover that their own attorney would be addressing me as Your Honor. But before I tell you about that moment when their faces went white as courthouse marble, I need to take you back to where it all began. Back to the night they decided their reputation mattered more than their daughter. October had always been my favorite month. The leaves turning gold, the air crisp enough to make you feel alive, everything smelling like possibility. But that October when I was 16, the season felt different, heavy, like the sky was pressing down on our small town, and everyone could sense something was about to break. I'd been carrying my secret for 3 months. 3 months of morning sickness disguised as stomach flu, of loose sweaters and careful posture, of staring at my reflection and wondering how long I could hide what was happening to my body. The test had been positive on a Tuesday. 2 pink lines that changed everything. I'd bought it with babysitting money from the drugstore on Main Street, the same place where everyone knew everyone, where Mrs. Henderson behind the counter had watched me grow up buying penny candy and school supplies. The fear wasn't just about being pregnant at 16. It was about what it would mean in our house. My parents, Harold and Denise, had built their entire identity around respectability. Dad was a deacon at First Baptist. Mom taught Sunday school and organized the church potluck dinners. They lived for the approval of others, for the nods and smiles that came with being seen as the perfect Christian family. And here I was, their only daughter, about to shatter that image into 1,000,000 irreparable pieces. I practiced the conversation in my head for weeks. How I'd tell them, what I'd say, how I'd explain that this didn't make me a bad person. I imagined tears, maybe anger, but eventually understanding. Parents are supposed to love you through anything, right? They're supposed to catch you when you fall, not push you off the cliff. The night I finally told them, the kitchen smelled like pot roast and disappointment. Mom was wiping down counters with the methodical precision she applied to everything in her life. Dad sat at the head of the table, reading the newspaper like it contained the secrets of the universe. The normalcy of it all made what I was about to say feel even more impossible. I cleared my throat. The sound seemed to echo in the quiet room. They both looked up, and I saw my childhood in their faces. Dad teaching me to ride a bike in the driveway. Mom braiding my hair for school pictures. All of it about to become a memory. "I need to tell you something," I said. My voice sounded smaller than I'd practiced. Mom set down her dish rag. Dad folded his newspaper with a sharp crease. They waited. "I'm pregnant." The silence that followed wasn't the kind you hear. It was the kind you feel in your chest, pressing against your ribs like you're underwater. Mom's hand went to her throat. Dad's jaw tightened until I could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. Then the questions came. Not the caring kind, the interrogating kind. Who was the father? How could I have been so stupid? Did I have any idea what this would do to their reputation? Not once did either of them ask if I was okay. Not once did they ask what I needed or how scared I was. The boy was Tommy Martinez from my chemistry class. Sweet, quiet Tommy who worked at his uncle's garage after school and dreamed of becoming a mechanic. We'd been dating for 6 months, holding hands in the hallway and sharing lunches in the cafeteria. Neither of us had planned for this to happen. We were kids playing at being grown-ups, and suddenly we were facing consequences that felt bigger than our entire world. But my parents didn't want to hear about Tommy, or about how this had happened, or about anything except how I was going to fix their problem. Because that's what I'd become to them in the space of 2 words. Not their daughter who was scared and needed them. Just a problem that threatened everything they'd built. The ultimatum came 3 days later. I'd been walking around the house like a ghost, sleeping fitfully, barely eating. The tension was so thick you could have cut it with a butter knife. Dad called me into the living room after dinner. Mom sat on the couch, hands folded, looking like she was attending a funeral. "You have 2 choices," Dad said. His voice was calm, controlled, the same tone he used when reading scripture from the pulpit. "You can go away somewhere until this is over and give the baby up for adoption, or you can leave this house tonight." I stared at him. This man who'd taught me to throw a baseball, who'd checked under my bed for monsters when I was little, who'd clapped the loudest at my school plays. The father who was supposed to protect me was offering me 2 versions of abandonment. "What about keeping the baby?" I whispered. Mom spoke for the first time in days. "Not in this house. Not with our name." I looked between them, these 2 people who'd shaped my entire world, and realized I was looking at strangers. The parents I'd known, the ones who'd kissed scraped knees and helped with homework, they were gone. In their place sat 2 people more concerned with what the neighbors would think than with their own child's well-being. "I choose to leave," I said. The words came out stronger than I felt. Dad nodded like I'd just confirmed something he'd already decided. Mom turned her face away. "Pack your things. You have an hour." That's how I found myself standing on the front porch at 11 o'clock on a school night, holding a garbage bag full of clothes and wondering where 16-year-old pregnant girls go when the people who are supposed to love them unconditionally decide they don't. The October air bit through my jacket, and I could see my breath in small puffs of white. Behind me, the house I'd grown up in glowed warm and yellow through the windows, but I was locked out of that warmth forever. I walked 6 blocks to the only place I could think of. Grandma Margaret's house, the little blue cottage at the end of Maple Street where the porch light always stayed on, and the cookie jar was never empty, where love didn't come with conditions or fine print. When she opened the door and saw me standing there shivering with my pathetic bag of belongings, she didn't ask questions. She just pulled me inside and wrapped me in arms that smelled like vanilla and safety. She held me while I sobbed, great heaving cries that came from somewhere deeper than sadness. She rocked me like I was 5 years old again, and for the first time in days, I felt like maybe I was going to survive this. "Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next," she whispered into my hair. "Tonight, you're home." And I was. For the first time since I'd seen those 2 pink lines, I was home. Lines, I was home. Grandma Margaret didn't just give me shelter that night. She gave me something I'd forgotten existed. Hope. The kind that doesn't announce itself with fanfare but settles quietly in your chest like a warm coal, glowing steady through the darkest hours. Her house was everything my childhood home wasn't. Cluttered in the most beautiful way, with Afghans draped over every chair and photographs covering every surface. Pictures of family gatherings, church picnics, school graduations. A life lived fully, messily, joyfully. The kitchen always smelled like something good was baking, and she had this way of humming while she worked that made even washing dishes feel like a celebration. The first morning I woke up in her spare room, sunlight streaming through curtains she'd sewn herself. I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not the complete absence of fear, but the presence of someone who would stand between me and whatever was coming next. She made me breakfast without asking what I wanted. Scrambled, eggs, toast cut diagonally the way she'd done when I was little, orange juice in the glass with the chip on the rim that she refused to throw away because it had sentimental value. Everything was exactly as I remembered from summer visits and holiday dinners, back when life was simple enough to fit inside a child's understanding. "We need to talk about practical things," she said, settling into the chair across from me with her coffee. "But first, how are you feeling?" Really feeling, not the answer you think I want to hear. I set down my fork. Nobody had asked me that question since this whole nightmare began. Scared, I admitted. Tired, angry, sad. Like my whole life just ended and I don't know how to start a new one. She nodded, stirring cream into her coffee with slow, thoughtful circles. Those are honest feelings. Good feelings to have when your world turns upside down. Means you're paying attention. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now you finish school. Now you take care of yourself and that baby. Now you learn that being thrown away doesn't make you garbage. It just means some people don't recognize treasure when they see it." The tears came again, but these were different. Not the desperate, drowning sobs of that first night, but the kind that wash things clean. She reached across the table and took my hand, her fingers soft and warm and steady. Over the next few weeks, Grandma Margaret became my fortress against a world that seemed determined to judge me. She drove me to my first prenatal appointment in her old Buick that smelled like peppermints and prayers. She sat with me in the waiting room, holding my hand while other women stared and whispered. She asked the doctor questions I didn't know to ask, and took notes in her careful handwriting. At school, things got harder before they got easier. Word spread the way it does in small towns, through grocery store checkout lines and church fellowship halls. I became the cautionary tale mothers used with their daughters, the example teachers pointed to when discussing consequences, the proof that good girls from good families could fall just as far as anyone else. Some days I wanted to disappear entirely, to transfer schools or drop out or just vanish into thin air. But Grandma Margaret had other plans. She picked me up every day at 3:30 sharp, waiting in the pickup line like any other grandmother. She asked about my classes and helped with homework, and never once made me feel like my pregnancy was something to be ashamed of. "You're carrying life," she'd say when I got discouraged. "That's not a mistake. That's a miracle with timing you didn't plan." The baby's father, Tommy, tried to step up in his 17-year-old way. He brought me flowers from his mother's garden and promised he'd get a better job, that we'd figure it out together. Sweet, earnest Tommy, who didn't understand that good intentions couldn't pay for diapers or doctor bills or the hundreds of things babies need. His parents were kind but practical. They had 3 other children and a mortgage and dreams of sending Tommy to community college. Love doesn't always come with financial backing. Grandma Margaret never made Tommy feel unwelcome, but she also never pretended he was the solution to our problems. She treated him with the gentle firmness she used on everyone, expecting respect and responsibility while understanding the limitations of youth. He could visit, he could help where he was able, but this baby's future rested on different shoulders. My parents might as well have moved to another planet. They drove past Grandma's house on their way to church every Sunday, eyes straight ahead, pretending they didn't know their daughter lived 3 streets away from their perfect life. At the grocery store, Mom would turn down a different aisle if she saw me coming. Dad stopped acknowledging me entirely, as if I'd simply ceased to exist. The rejection carved itself deeper each time. Not just the loss of their love, but the public nature of their denial. Everyone in town knew they'd thrown me out. Everyone watched them pretend they had no daughter while their grandchild grew inside me. The cruelty of it took my breath away on the days when I let myself think about it too long. But Grandma Margaret filled the spaces they left empty. She came to every doctor's appointment, every ultrasound, every class for new mothers. She knitted blankets and booties in yellow and green because we wanted to be surprised. She read books about child development and asked her friends for advice, and treated my pregnancy like the blessed event she insisted it was. When I graduated high school, 8 months pregnant and proud, she was in the front row with a camera and a bouquet of daisies. She cheered loud enough for 3 people when they called my name, making up for the 2 empty seats where my parents should have been. Later, she framed my diploma and hung it in her living room next to pictures of all her other grandchildren's accomplishments. The night I went into labor, everything happened fast. One minute I was washing dishes after dinner, the next I was doubled over with a contraction that felt like it was splitting me in half. Grandma Margaret moved with the efficiency of someone who'd been through this before, grabbing the hospital bag we'd packed weeks earlier and helping me to the car. "Drive careful, but fast," she told herself, hands steady on the wheel while I gripped the door handle and tried to remember how to breathe. The delivery was long and hard and beautiful in ways I couldn't have imagined. When they placed my son in my arms, red-faced and screaming and absolutely perfect, I understood something fundamental about love. It wasn't conditional, it wasn't earned, it just was, complete and overwhelming and strong enough to rearrange your entire understanding of what mattered. Jacob Thomas. 7 pounds, 3 ounces of pure possibility. He had my nose, and Tommy's dark hair and eyes that seemed to hold all the wisdom in the world. Grandma Margaret cried harder than I did, holding him like the precious gift he was. "You did good, baby girl," she whispered. "You did so good." In that hospital room, surrounded by the smell of antiseptic and new beginnings, I made a promise to my son. I would give him everything I had. I would work harder than anyone expected. I would build a life worthy of the trust he'd placed in me by choosing me as his mother. And someday, when he was old enough to understand, I would tell him that love isn't about perfect circumstances. It's about perfect commitment. The first few years were a blur of sleepless nights and community college classes. Grandma Margaret watched Jacob while I studied, singing him lullabies in her creaky rocking chair, and spoiling him with the kind of attention only grandmothers know how to give. She never complained about the crying or the diapers or the way babies turn peaceful houses into chaos. She just loved us both with the fierce devotion of someone who understood that families come in all shapes and sizes. I worked part-time at the local diner, saving every penny I could while earning my associate's degree. The work was hard, standing on my feet for hours, dealing with difficult customers, smelling like grease and coffee at the end of every shift. But it was honest work, and it put food on the table and paid for textbooks, and slowly built toward something bigger. Some nights, after Jacob was asleep and my homework was finished, I'd sit on Grandma Margaret's porch and dream about the future. Not the fairy tale version where everything worked out easily, but the real version where hard work and determination could carve out a decent life. I dreamed about Jacob having opportunities I'd never had. I dreamed about being someone he could be proud of. I dreamed about the day when the people who'd counted me out would have to reckon with who I'd become. Those dreams felt impossible some days, especially when bills piled up or Jacob got sick, or the weight of responsibility pressed down like a physical thing. But Grandma Margaret had this way of making impossible things seem merely difficult. She'd sit beside me on that porch swing and remind me that every worthwhile journey starts with a single step. "You're not the same girl who showed up here with a garbage bag," she'd say. "You're stronger now. Focused. You know what you're fighting for." And she was right. Motherhood had changed me in ways I was still discovering. It had given me a backbone I didn't know I possessed and a clarity about what mattered that cut through all the noise. Jacob needed me to succeed, and that need became the engine that drove everything else. When he turned 3, I transferred to the State University to finish my bachelor's degree. The commute was long, the course load heavy, but I was determined to show my son that education was the ladder out of any circumstances. I studied while he played at my feet, wrote papers during his naps, and somehow managed to maintain a grade point average that surprised even me. The day I graduated with my bachelor's degree, Grandma Margaret and Jacob sat in the audience wearing matching proud smiles. I walked across that stage thinking about the girl who'd been thrown away at 16, and I knew she'd be amazed at who she'd become. But that was just the beginning. Because somewhere in those years of late nights and early mornings, of juggling motherhood and education and survival, I'd discovered something that would change everything. I had a mind for justice, for the law, for standing up to people who thought they could push others around simply because they had more power or money or social standing. Law school was calling, and I was ready to answer. Law school acceptance letters arrive on ordinary days, in ordinary mailboxes, carrying extraordinary news. Mine came on a Tuesday afternoon in March, sandwiched between grocery store circulars and credit card offers. Jacob was 7 then, old enough to understand that the thin envelope in my trembling hands held the power to reshape our entire future. I stared at the return address for a full minute before opening it, afraid that reading the words might make them disappear. Grandma Margaret stood beside me in the kitchen, dish towel twisted in her hands, waiting with the patience of someone who'd spent decades watching dreams either bloom or wither. The letter began with congratulations. Such a simple word, but it hit me like lightning splitting the sky. I'd been accepted. Me, the girl who'd been discarded like yesterday's newspaper, was going to law school. The girl who'd once believed her life was over at 16 was about to begin the chapter that would define everything. Jacob looked up from his coloring book, crayon suspended in midair. "What's it say, Mama?" "It says we're moving to the city, baby. Mama's going to become a lawyer." Grandma Margaret's eyes filled with tears that caught the afternoon light streaming through her kitchen window. She pulled me into one of those hugs that feels like coming home and staying safe all at once. "I knew you would," she whispered. "I knew it from the day you showed up on my doorstep. You had that look in your eyes, like you were going to fight your way back from whatever tried to break you. The next 3 years tested every ounce of strength I'd built. Law school doesn't care about your story or your circumstances or how many hours you slept the night before. It demands everything you have and then asks for more." I lived in a tiny apartment near campus, Jacob sleeping on a pull-out couch, in what generously could be called a living room. We ate more ramen noodles than any 2 people should, and I learned to study with cartoons playing in the background because that's what motherhood teaches you. Adaptation. Some nights, after Jacob fell asleep and the apartment finally grew quiet, I'd sit at my makeshift desk surrounded by casebooks and highlighters, feeling the weight of everything I was trying to accomplish. The exhaustion would settle in my bones like winter cold, and I'd wonder if I was crazy to think a girl like me belonged in a profession full of people who'd never known what it felt like to choose between groceries and textbooks. But then I'd look over at my son, peaceful and trusting in his sleep, and remember why I was doing this. Not just for us, but for every person who'd ever been told they weren't good enough, smart enough, worthy enough to sit at tables where decisions get made. I was earning my place at those tables, one case study at a time. The professors were intimidating in that particular way academics master, asking questions designed to expose the gaps in your preparation rather than build on your knowledge. Some of my classmates had fathers who were judges, mothers who were partners at prestigious firms. They spoke in legal terminology that sounded like a foreign language to my small-town ears. But I learned to translate their confidence into my own voice, to find power in precision rather than pedigree. Constitutional law became my sanctuary. Something about the framework of justice, the idea that rights could be protected through careful argument and precedent, spoke to the part of me that had been denied basic dignity at 16. I spent extra hours in the library, not just because I had to work harder than my classmates, but because every case felt personal. Every ruling that protected the vulnerable felt like vindication for the girl who'd been thrown away. Study groups were awkward at first. These polished young people with their family connections and summer internships at white shoe firms couldn't quite figure out what to do with the single mother who brought her 7-year-old to campus events because she couldn't afford babysitters. But competence has a way of breaking down barriers. When they realized I could hold my own in constitutional analysis and write briefs that made professors take notice, the whispers stopped mattering. Jacob adapted to our new life with the resilience children possess when they trust the adult making decisions. He learned to do homework in law library study rooms, to whisper in places where serious people did serious work, to be proud when his mama got called on in class even though he didn't understand what any of it meant. Some evenings, he'd sit beside me while I outlined cases, drawing pictures of what he imagined courtrooms looked like. Always, in his drawings, his mama stood at a tall wooden podium wearing a black robe, looking important. The financial strain never completely lifted. Student loans covered tuition, but living expenses stretched every dollar until it screamed. I worked as a research assistant for professors, typed papers for other students, did whatever brought in grocery money without compromising my grades. Pride is a luxury poor people can't afford, but dignity costs nothing. And I held on to that with both hands. During my second year, something shifted. The concepts that had once felt foreign began clicking into place like puzzle pieces finding their proper spots. I started raising my hand in class, not from desperation to be noticed, but from genuine engagement with ideas that mattered. Professors began remembering my name, nodding approvingly when I offered analysis that cut through complexity to find the heart of legal arguments. The summer between my second and third years, I landed an internship with the public defender's office. It didn't pay much, barely enough to cover childcare for Jacob, but it gave me something more valuable than money. It gave me purpose, real purpose, not the abstract kind discussed in academic settings, but the immediate, urgent kind that shows up in holding cells and courtrooms where people's lives hang in the balance. My first client was a 19-year-old girl charged with shoplifting diapers. She sat across from me in the cramped interview room, eyes hollow with exhaustion, explaining that her baby had been crying for hours and she just wanted the sound to stop. I saw myself in her desperation, remembered the calculations I'd once made about necessities versus pride. The case was minor, but the stakes felt enormous. This girl's future, her ability to care for her child, her belief that the system could show mercy to people who made mistakes born of desperation. We negotiated a plea that kept her out of jail, got her connected with social services, helped her find resources she didn't know existed. When she hugged me outside the courthouse, tears streaming down both our faces, I understood something fundamental about the law I wanted to practice. Justice wasn't just about punishment or precedent. It was about recognizing the humanity in people who'd been reduced to case numbers and charges. That internship led to others. Criminal defense, family law, civil rights organizations that fought battles for people who couldn't afford to fight them alone. Each experience added layers to my understanding of how the legal system worked, and more importantly, how it failed the people who needed it most. I learned to speak the language of motions and briefs, but I never forgot the language of desperation I'd learned at 16. Third-year students get to participate in clinic programs, representing real clients under faculty supervision. I threw myself into every case with the intensity of someone who understood that behind every file folder was a human being whose life could be changed by the quality of representation they received. My supervising professor, a woman who'd spent decades in public service, pulled me aside after a particularly challenging case. "You have good instincts," she said. "More than that, you have perspective most lawyers never develop. You understand what it means when the system works and when it doesn't, because you've been on both sides of that equation." She was right. I'd been the person who needed help and couldn't afford it, who faced a system that seemed designed to crush people who started life without advantages. Now I was learning to navigate that same system from the inside, to use its own rules to protect people who looked like the girl I'd once been. Law school graduation felt surreal. 3 years of sacrifice and study culminating in a ceremony where families gathered to celebrate achievements that had seemed impossible just a few years before. Jacob, now 10 and suddenly looking so grown up in his button-down shirt, sat in the audience next to Grandma Margaret, who'd insisted on making the trip despite her arthritis and the long drive. When they called my name, when I walked across that stage to receive my diploma, I thought about every night I'd studied until my eyes burned. Every morning I'd gotten up before dawn to review notes before Jacob woke up. Every moment I'd doubted whether I was smart enough or strong enough to see this through. The diploma felt heavier than paper should, weighted with years of determination and dreams that had refused to die. The bar exam loomed like a final boss in a video game, the ultimate test that would determine whether 3 years of law school had actually prepared me to practice law. 2 months of intensive studying, practice tests, and anxiety that made my stomach churn like a washing machine. Jacob spent those weeks tiptoeing around our apartment, understanding somehow that Mama was fighting the biggest battle of her academic life. Results came by mail, another ordinary envelope carrying extraordinary news. I passed. Not just passed, but scored high enough to make my professors proud, and my own eyes fill with tears of relief and accomplishment. The girl who'd been deemed a disappointment and a failure had just earned the right to practice law in any court in the state. But passing the bar was just the beginning. The real work started when I accepted a position with the Public Defender's Office, representing people who couldn't afford private attorneys. The pay was modest, the caseload overwhelming, the working conditions far from glamorous. But every day brought the opportunity to stand between vulnerable people and a system that could crush them without adequate representation. My first day in court as a licensed attorney, I wore a black suit I'd bought on sale and shoes that pinched my feet, but looked professional. I carried a briefcase that had seen better days, but held all my hopes for what kind of lawyer I wanted to be. When I stood to address the judge, my voice steady and clear, I felt the presence of every person who'd helped me reach that moment. Grandma Margaret, who'd given me shelter when I had nowhere else to go. Jacob, who'd sacrificed a traditional childhood so his mother could chase dreams that seemed impossible. Even in some strange way, my parents, whose abandonment had forged the steel in my spine. The cases came in steady streams. Drug possession charges for people who needed treatment more than punishment. Domestic violence situations where victims felt trapped between danger and destitution. Immigration violations for families seeking better lives in a country that promised opportunity but delivered bureaucracy. Each case taught me something new about the intersection of law and human suffering, about the difference between legal justice and moral justice. Years passed in a blur of courtroom appearances, plea negotiations, and late-night case preparation. Jacob grew from a child who colored pictures of courtrooms into a teenager who understood that his mother's work meant something beyond just paying bills. He'd come to my office sometimes, doing homework while I prepared for trials, absorbing lessons about justice and advocacy that no textbook could teach. My reputation grew slowly, built on cases won and clients served with dignity and competence. Other attorneys began referring difficult cases my way, recognizing that I brought something unique to legal representation. Not just technical skill, though I'd worked hard to develop that, but an understanding of what it felt like to be powerless in a system designed to protect those who already had advantages. The call came on a Thursday afternoon in my 15th year of practice. The governor's office, asking if I'd consider accepting an appointment to the county court bench. A judgeship. The opportunity to make decisions rather than just argue cases, to shape the administration of justice from a position of ultimate authority within the courtroom. Jacob was in college by then, studying engineering with the quiet confidence of someone who'd grown up watching his mother transform impossible dreams into reality. Grandma Margaret was in her 80s, still sharp but moving slower, still proud of every milestone I reached. When I called to tell her about the judicial appointment, her voice carried the satisfaction of someone who'd always known how the story would end. "I told you," she said softly. "I told you that first night when you showed up scared and broken. You were going to be something special. You were going to matter." The confirmation process was rigorous but straightforward. My record spoke for itself. 15 years of ethical practice, hundreds of cases handled with competence and compassion, a reputation for fairness that crossed party lines and professional boundaries. The local bar association endorsed me unanimously. Editorial writers praised the appointment of someone who understood the law from ground level up. But the most meaningful endorsement came from an unexpected source. A letter to the editor from a woman I'd represented years earlier in a custody case, explaining how my advocacy had saved her family and given her children a chance at stability. She wrote about lawyers who see clients as human beings rather than billable hours, about the difference it makes when someone in power remembers what it feels like to be powerless. The investiture ceremony was simple, elegant, weighted with tradition that stretched back centuries. I raised my right hand and swore to uphold the Constitution, to administer justice without regard to person or position, to be fair and impartial in all my decisions. The black robes felt heavier than I'd expected, carrying the authority of every judge who'd worn them before me, and the responsibility of everyone who would appear before my bench. Jacob beamed from the audience, now a young man whose childhood had been shaped by watching his mother fight for dignity and respect. Grandma Margaret sat beside him, tears of pride streaming down cheeks lined with years of worry and hope. In the back of the courtroom, I spotted faces from my past, former clients who'd made the effort to witness this moment, colleagues who'd become friends, people whose lives had intersected with mine in ways that mattered. The first case on my docket as a judge was a minor traffic violation, routine and unremarkable. But when I took the bench for the first time, when I looked out at the courtroom from this new perspective, I felt the weight of every journey that had led to this moment. From pregnant teenager to homeless girl to struggling student, to exhausted law student to overworked public defender to the person who now held the gavel. Power, I realized, wasn't about the title or the robes or the elevated bench. It was about the opportunity to ensure that everyone who entered my courtroom would be treated with the dignity I'd once been denied. It was about making sure that justice wasn't just for people who could afford expensive attorneys, or who came from families with connections. My parents had no idea. In all the years since they'd thrown me out, we'd had no contact. They still lived in the same small town, still attended the same church, still maintained the facade of respectability that had mattered more than their own daughter. The local newspaper covered my appointment, but whether they read it or cared was beyond my knowledge or concern. I'd built a life without them, created a family with Grandma Margaret and Jacob that was stronger and more loving than the one I'd been born into. Their approval, which had once felt necessary for my very survival, had become irrelevant to my sense of worth. The girl who'd once begged for their love had grown into a woman who no longer needed their validation. But life has a way of bringing stories full circle, often when you least expect it. And sometimes the very people who tried to write you out of their narrative find themselves forced to reckon with the chapters you wrote without them. 20 years after they'd decided I was too shameful to share their name, my parents would discover exactly who their discarded daughter had become. And they would make that discovery in the most humiliating way possible, by hiring a lawyer to sue me, only to watch that same lawyer address me with the respect they'd never shown. The universe, it seemed, had its own sense of justice. And sometimes that justice wore black robes and carried a gavel that had been earned one impossible dream at a time. At a time. That moment in the courtroom when their lawyer said, "Good morning, Judge," wasn't just vindication. It was the sound of a story coming full circle, of every sleepless night and impossible dream finally finding its voice. The look on my parents' faces, the color draining away as they realized the daughter they'd thrown away now held the gavel, wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. The truth that rock bottom isn't your ending, it's your foundation. From that plastic bag of clothes on Grandma Margaret's doorstep to the black robes of judicial authority, every step was earned through tears and determination. Every late night studying while Jacob slept, every moment I chose hope over despair, every time I refused to let their abandonment define my worth. The scared 16-year-old girl who once believed her life was over had grown into a woman who now safeguarded justice for others. If you're watching this and you've been counted out, written off, or told you'll never amount to anything, remember this. Your beginning doesn't determine your ending. The people who can't see your worth today might one day find themselves standing in rooms where your name commands respect. Not because you sought revenge, but because you sought something better, because you refused to let their limitations become your ceiling. The greatest victory isn't making them regret what they lost. It's becoming someone so complete, so purposeful, that their regret becomes irrelevant. Sometimes the best response to being thrown away is to prove you were never garbage in the first place, You were treasure they were too blind to recognize.